Here's just the basic question we want to tackle today. Is there any evidence for the Exodus? All right. Here is a very common response you'll see in secular media to that question from an archaeologist named Stephen Roseberg, and this was in the Jerusalem Post. The short answer is no. The whole subject of the Exodus is embarrassing to archaeologists, he says. It is embarrassing that there is no evidence outside the Bible to support it. You catch it? No. So we prefer not to talk about it and hate to be asked about it. Okay, this is a common, if you look up the Exodus, it is very common to find in secular materials this type of quote or phrase. There is none, no evidence at all. That's what they say. So what is our job today? We're going to deal with that question and see if there is any evidence. But we're going to start with covering a few of the limitations of archaeology and what we should expect to find when we talk about the evidence. First of all, you should never expect to find an Egyptian inscription by a pharaoh describing the events of the Exodus. That is not going to happen. Why? What was the purpose of royal Egyptian inscriptions? They never report negative things. You're the pharaoh. Why are you going to say bad things about yourself? You're just not going to do that. What is the purpose of royal Egyptian inscriptions? To bring glory to Pharaoh. All right? So we should not expect to find some stele recording all the events of the Exodus from the Egyptian point of view. Now, also when we talk about, I've seen quotes about the wandering in the wilderness and how, there's no evidence of that. And so they wandered the desert as nomads for 40 years. What kind of evidence are people living in tents, moving around, going to leave that is going to survive for 3,000 plus years? It's not. It seems it's one of those arguments that makes no sense to me. You should not expect to find. They're not building buildings, so there's no foundational remains to find. They're not, so it doesn't make evidence. It's one of those arguments that just to me is, you can make that statement, but it's kind of circular reasoning. You should not expect to find that kind of evidence in the wilderness, okay? Other limits. Now, the land of Goshen's up in the Nile Delta, which is north in Egypt. And this is where the Israelites lived. And here's the reality. The Nile, before the Aswan Dam, floods annually, okay? And what does flood water do to buildings and, we'll say, papyrus paper type records? Yeah, it don't last. So it is famous to find papyrus documents from Egypt, not from the Delta. That is in the southern, more arid, dry region. That's where that's going to survive. And so papyrus records do not tend to survive in the Delta, so it would be the exception to find records from the area that the Israelites were in. So that's where we at. So we know the skeptics commonly say there's no evidence, and we know there are limitations on studying this. So the question we're going to ask today is, and I believe the Bible, so even if there was no direct physical evidence, it doesn't affect my impact of my belief. But is there any evidence? That's the question we're going to tackle today. Is there any synchronisms with material culture from the biblical text? What's a synchronism? A concurrence of events in time. Are there discoveries that we can look at from the Egyptian or Holy Land material culture record that is left behind that matches up with what we find in the biblical text? All right. So we're going to start with the question, is there any evidence the Israelites were ever in Egypt? Because that's the next step. They say, there's no evidence of that. So we're going to start with the tomb of Kahunotep II. He was a nomarch in and he was buried at Beni Hassan in Egypt, okay? Now he had a elaborate tomb, which is obviously, as we know, Egyptian is common. And his paintings and inscriptions help us know about life in 19th century BC Egypt. One wall painting from about 1870 shows a group of nomadic Semites. Now, what is a Semite? A Semite is a person from the Levant, Canaan. A Semite is what an ancient Hebrew would be, okay? before they become Israel as a country, all right? So this shows nomadic Semites entering Egypt with their livestock and spices. So here's the thing. These people were painted in detail, give us an insight into the look and style of people from Canaan at the time of the patriarchs. All right, so now here's a picture of the tomb painting as it exists, and I'm going to show you a cleaned up so we can get a better look. Look at their cloaks. See the pretty colors? What was Joseph given by his daddy? Coat of many colors, a beautiful, yeah, okay. And this is that time frame, okay? And so we see here an example of that. So we see people, it shows us a synchronism with the patriarchal period. And this would be the time when the Hebrews are first coming into Egypt, and we're seeing trade with people from Canaan. You notice the multicolored cloaks, okay? And we talked about Joseph. All right. So this is circa the time of Jacob, Joseph, and the brothers. And again, the synchronism matches well. Now, let's talk about a papyrus. This is called the Papyrus Brooklyn, and it's from the 17th century BC from Egypt, likely around Thebes. And this is the period after the time of Joseph, but well before the Exodus, okay? There's a list of 95 household servants on this papyrus that were servants for a noble woman in Egypt. 45 of the servants have Asiatic or Semitic names. An Asiatic or Semite, again, is a person from the Levant, from Canaan. What an ancient Hebrew would be. But it gets a little more specific. Okay, we'll talk about that in a second. The presence of so many of these foreigners in one single household suggests that at this time in Egypt, that the population of the Asiatic Semite community was increasing rapidly. All right? Now, of the Semitic servants, 9 of them have names we specifically can identify as Hebrew. Okay? And there's Shiphrah, which is the same name. Remember the midwives from the when Moses is put in the Nile in the bulrushes, and what are you supposed to throw all the male babies in the river? Yeah, and the midwives, we can't do that, king. I'm sure they paid a price for that. And Shiphrah was one of the names. So this is not her. This predates her by a couple centuries, but it's the same name. And we find a couple other examples. There are 9 of them in total that are clearly Hebrew names. At the time, the Bible places the Hebrews in Egypt. Okay? So it's a clear attestation of them in Egypt, and it's the period likely before their enslavement. Okay? And it shows how many of them have come south for work. And so that's interesting. We see the correlation. So let's look at another tomb. This is the tomb of a guy named Rekhmire, and this drops us down a couple more centuries, okay? This is now in the 18th dynasty of ancient Egypt. Rekhmire was the vizier, the head governor, we might say, the head honcho under the Pharaoh, under Tutmosis III and Amenhotep II. I mentioned them again. You notice my little note, remember their names. I'm going to say it again, Tutmosis III and Amenhotep II. This tomb is very well preserved, and they're brilliantly painted from scenes of everyday life. But I want to look at one section of the tomb mural that features slaves of the time. Okay? Now, who are these people? This mural features Semitic or Asiatic slaves. And I've mentioned it a couple times now. What would a Hebrew be? Okay? And they are doing what? They are making bricks of mud and straw. Isn't that interesting? All right. Does that match up to anything you've heard in the biblical text? Now, I want you to remember the name of the 2 pharaohs that this guy served, because we're going to talk about a time frame in just a minute. The name of the pharaohs were Tutmosis III and Amenhotep II. Because now we're going to talk about when did the Exodus happen. Now, this is a really big topic that you could spend a whole session just discussing, because scholars, even good biblical scholars, are split on this topic, okay? And I'm going to say it the way I understand it in plain English. In the 50s and 60s, even Bible-believing scholars, they decided that the evidence seemed to suggest the Exodus was happening in the 13th century BC, the 1200s, okay? And some of these were good men who were trying to defend the Bible, but here's the problem. Was that the date that the text gave us? The answer is no, okay? So when you see a lot of material on the Exodus today, and I remember a documentary I watched where a good archaeologist was talking about the remains of Semites that was excavated on his site. And he was asked, could these be the early Israelites? And he said, no. He said, these can't be the proto-Israelites. Said it's too early because the scholar probably assumed the Exodus happened in the 1200s. But he didn't read his text. So what does the text say? That's what a lot of scholars presume, but is it the date the Bible records? So there are several verses that point to a date, and I'm going to give you the one that gives us the most specific, and you can look up several articles at ABR we can refer you to that gives you all the other information. Look at 1 Kings 6:1. And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, that he began to build the house of the Lord. What is that verse doing? It is giving us a date. It is giving us information. In the 4th year of his reign, Solomon began to build the temple. But it was the 480th year after they came out of Egypt. It gives us a date for the Exodus if we know when Solomon began to build the temple. And here's what's interesting. The scholars generally agree on a date for the building of the temple, 966 or 967 BC. So if we just take 966 and add 480, our basic number is 1446 BC. Ladies and gentlemen, does that sound like the 1200s to you? Not to me either. It's a couple hundred centuries earlier, isn't it? So here's the question. Is there any evidence at the time the Bible gives? Now, remember that tomb we just talked about with Reckmeyer and the 2 pharaohs he served and the slaves making mud bricks? Guess what time that tomb is from? The 15th century, the mid-1400s BC. Isn't that interesting? All right? Now, so let's talk about the biblical date. 1446 is in the 15th century, certainly not a 13th century date. What is happening in Egypt at this time? This is during the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom. This is one of the greatest dynasties of Egyptian history. And so we're going to take a minute and we're going to take a little bit of a detour. And I want to talk about an artifact on display, and I'm going to get a little drink of water. And by the way, this is my 5th presentation in less than 24 hours. That is a record for me, and it is amazing I'm still speaking plainly. Or if you're not sure about my accent, maybe not so much. But so we're going to take a little detour. We've given you some background information, and I want to look at some verses, and we're going to hone in on one of the pharaohs of the oppression, the Pharaoh Moses ran from, and we're going to then pull all this back together. So let's read some verses from Exodus chapters 2, 3, and 4. When Pharaoh heard about this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned because of their difficult labor, and they cried out. And their cry for help ascended to God because of their difficult labor. Then the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in a flame of fire within the bush. So now we skip down to the burning bush account. And when God speaks to Moses, he says something interesting for our study today. Chapter 4, verse 19. Now in Midian, the Lord told Moses, return to Egypt, for all the men who wanted to kill you are dead. Who wanted to kill Moses? The Pharaoh. This seems to suggest to us that the Pharaoh that Moses ran from has now died. And God is sending him back to Egypt, right? Now here's the question. All right? There's an important clue here. All right? And it goes into how long Moses was in the wilderness. Does anybody know how long Moses was in the wilderness? 40 years. We know that, right? Okay. So, if the Pharaoh has now died that Moses ran from, how long did that Pharaoh have to sit on the throne given this information? At least 40 years, right? Now, this is where it gets interesting. I want to talk about a guy named Tutmosis III. We've mentioned him by name already. He's considered one of the greatest pharaohs of Egyptian history. They call him the Napoleon of Egypt. He reigned for 54 years. He was the only pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. When did I tell you the biblical date for the Exodus correlates with? The only pharaoh of the 18th dynasty with a reign of 40 years or more. Did you catch that clue? It seems to be that this guy may well be the Pharaoh that Moses ran from. Okay? Now, as I've said all day, we don't want to be dogmatic. We want to just go where the evidence takes us. The text just gives the name, or gives the title Pharaoh, which is common. An Egyptian scribe of the New Kingdom would not write Pharaoh Joe. That only is later. You write Pharaoh only. So he's writing it as a scholar who had been trained at the time in Egypt is writing it properly just using the title. Okay? So let's look at an interesting artifact, and it is over here in our Egyptian display. Okay? It is an Egyptian scarab. It is right here. And no one has probably bent down to look at the image in the mirror. That's why I blow it up for you, okay? And scarabs were popular seal impressions, amulets. They represent a scarab beetle. And this one is from the 18th dynasty. And I want to show you a couple things. You see the Sphinx? It's got mirror images. There's a Sphinx on the top and the bottom. Do you see the circles with a line underneath? You see that? That's called a cartouche, okay? Now, ladies and gentlemen, and I like teaching our young people, if you go to a museum and you see the Egyptian hieroglyphs in the museum, you can show off. And when you look for that circular line, only you say, this is a cartouche. So I want you, that's your vocabulary word for that. They say cartouche. Okay, now, who can put their name in a cartouche? Only one guy or gal, Pharaoh. So anywhere you see the Egyptian reliefs, if you see that circle and line, you know it's a Pharaoh's name in it. Now, here's what's interesting. This particular artifact was suggested to me for these displays from a scholar with an Egyptian background named Dr. Doug Petrovich. Dr. Petrovich said, Tommy, you need this scarab. You need to get this scarab for your displays. Okay. And he said, why? I said, well, you see the cartouche? Yeah. He said, do you know whose name it is in the cartouche? And I said, Dr. P, you know I can't read those. I don't know the Egyptian hieroglyphs. I know you do. He smiled real big. He said, yeah, his name is Tutmosis III. And then he smiled and said, Tommy, do you know who that is? And I said, Dr. P, if we're right, that's the very Pharaoh Moses ran from. And he said, bingo. So, we think the evidence suggests that. Again, we don't want to be dogmatic, but when we look at all of the evidence, we have that on display here today, an artifact maybe from the very Pharaoh that Moses ran from while Egypt was at the height of its power, Tutmosis III. Okay? Now, there was a writer in later Egyptian history named Merneptah, and he was a Ptolemaic pharaoh. So this is, I forget the years. He's in the early 3rd century BC, so 1,100 years after the time of the Exodus. But he wrote an Egyptian history, and he was an Egyptian priest. And he records an event in his histories that appear to may well be an Egyptian view of the Exodus, the Egyptian side of the story. Now, what is interesting is he names the Pharaoh. It is the earliest ancient document that names the Pharaoh of this event. The name in Greek is Amenophis. It is the Greek for Amenhotep, okay? There were 4 pharaohs named Amenhotep, all in the 18th dynasty we're looking at. Now, we spent a little time getting to know Tutmosis III. If what I told you is correct, do we think we might be awful interested in his son? His son is named Amenhotep II. Interesting, all right? Now, Amenhotep II is the son of Tutmosis III. By the chronology we follow, he would likely be the pharaoh in the year 1446 BC, History reflects this guy was one of the cruelest pharaohs to ever sit the throne of Egypt. All right? He's a cruel dude from what we know of his time. All right? Like his father, who led many invasions into the Levant, he did lead military campaigns into the Levant, but here's what's fascinating on him. After his 9th year, it never happens again. All right? Which is strange to Egyptologists. Something's going on here. Why would this Pharaoh not continue to do what his father and he has done and lead campaigns into the Levant, into Canaan? All right? Why wouldn't you do that? No single text has survived from a major act or decree of any historical significance of his after that time. Now, I want to deviate from him just a minute, and I want to talk about a specific site that will relate to the time of his reign in a minute. The site is called Tel el-Daba, or Ancient Avaris, okay? Now, this site, the archaeology shows us, was established several hundred years before the time of our guy Amenhotep II. And what's interesting is it was established as a small community populated with Semites, okay? And this community is up in the northern part of Egypt in an area you might call Goshen, okay? And the population of Semites, we know by graves and the size of the place, the population explodes. And we find out something interesting about these people. Early on at this site, these Semitic people are being buried with wealthy grave goods. They're living large. Life is good, all right? And we know that because if you can bury somebody with expensive stuff, you don't need the expensive stuff because you got other expensive stuff, right? All right? So that tells us these people are living pretty good. But then, by their graves, we know something happened. Because at one point in history, the grave goods disappear, the expensive grave goods. They become graves of poor people. And archaeologists can study the bones of those people. And those people had something interesting that their bones tell us. Their life involved lots of hard physical labor. Now, what might that be evidence of? Interesting. Okay. Now, during the time of our guy Amenhotep II, he has a palace at the site. Now, this is interesting because a minimalist criticism of the biblical text years ago used to be that, well, you know, you've got Moses and Aaron, and the text seems to describe them from up in the North Goshen, going and talking to Pharaoh the same day, like they're walking across town. And that couldn't be, because we know the palaces are down in central Egypt. That takes days, if not weeks, to travel to. That doesn't make sense. Okay, fair criticism, until we now know that Amenhotep II had a palace at the site. So if you live there, you can walk across town. If Pharaoh will give you an audience, you can have an audience with Pharaoh, okay? Now, here's where it gets fascinating to me. Archaeology reveals a clear abandonment of this site, either during or at the end of the reign of Amenhotep II. I like what one of the secular archaeologists says. The quote, as I understand it, is, it's as if everybody packed up and moved off overnight. Well, what could that be? All right. But again, as Dr. Stripling says, you have to look at the right time at the right place. If you're expecting evidence in the 1200s, this doesn't mean anything to you. Okay. Now, by the way, do you know what they attribute the disappearance of all the people to? A plague. Okay. Interesting. So here's my question. Where do you think all those Semites went to? So, I think this is clear evidence of the accounts described in the Bible. Okay? And I think that's what we're seeing here in a lot of biblical scholars. The archaeologist who dug this site, to my knowledge, is not a believer. But he's a really good archaeologist who takes really good records, and then biblical scholars better look at this and say, oh my gosh, look at what's just right here staring us in the face. All right? Now, with that said, before we leave off, I want to look at another artifact before we move on. This is an ancient Egyptian pendant. It's on display in our case here. And we see a pharaoh or maybe an Egyptian deity flanked by two ladies, maybe wives or goddesses. But it's the back I want you to know. You see the nice papyrus reeds there? Right above that papyrus is one of those circles with a line underneath. What was that called? Cartouche. All right. This also came from Dr. P. And he said, you may want this one. Whose name is in the cartouche? Amenhotep II, who many biblical conservative scholars would suggest to you is likely the Pharaoh of the Exodus, okay? As always, we want to be careful, and you don't want to get so hung up on a theory that you just, this is absolutely has to be, when the text doesn't give us the full name. But gosh, the evidence seems to clearly point to this guy, okay? Now, with that said, is there any other evidence we should look at? So we're going to look at an inscription from the time of the grandson of Amenhotep II, Amenhotep III. And he built a temple to honor his god Amun-Ra at Soleb in Nubia. And as pharaohs like to do, when you're a pharaoh, I think it's required you have a big ego. So you are required to brag about all of your important military conquests, whether you really did them or not, or did as much as you brag about. And so he brags about all these territories he claims to have conquered. And as you can see in the image, each one is depicted by a name ring. So you have the image like a cartouche, and you see a person above it. The person above it is a prisoner. He has his arms tied behind his back. And all of these name rings has the name of the territory in the name ring recorded that the Pharaoh claims to have conquered, and the image above the person represents a person from that territory. All right? So he talks about several African territories he claims to have conquered, and you can see that the people have an African heritage, okay? Now, there is one particular inscription that is very interesting. And it is recorded on this one that the enemy is from the land of the Shashu, which means nomads, of Yahweh. Everybody know who Yahweh is? God. It is the name for God. The context places this with the other name rings it's around in the region of Canaan. Now, hang on just a minute. All right? Also, the prisoner is clearly portrayed to be Semitic. Somebody from the region of Canaan, okay? All right? And here's the thing. Grandson of Amenhotep II. So here's what this tells us. Sometime around 1400 BC, in the area of Canaan, there was a nomadic people. All right? Or semi-nomadic, who worshiped a god named Yahweh. This is our first recording of the name of Yahweh in the historical record, to my knowledge. And look when it is. This is the time frame the text would put the Hebrews into coming into the land and the early Judges period. All right? Doesn't that match so well? Yeah. All right, so let's move on, and I want to talk about some other cuneiform tablets that I would love and would absolutely reject if I was offered one for these presentations, because I would never want to be responsible for it. It's called the Amarna letters. Amarna letters. All right, so what are these things? They are cuneiform tablets found in Amarna, Egypt, from a site where the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten built a capital. And way back in the late 1800s, the locals realized these were worth money, so they dig them up and sell them on the antiquities market. Well, long story short, they were able to kind of collect these and figure out what came from where, and scholars were able to read the cuneiform and interpret them, as the cuneiform at this time was kind of the English of the day, the language franca of business. So these are correspondence letters written to Pharaoh. Many of them come from the Canaanite city-state kings. So this is a world where your large cities often control areas, and so the head of the city would call himself a king, or we might say mayor today, but they would be so we find these, and they're written to 3 18th dynasty pharaohs: Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, and Tutankhamun. Okay, these tend to range for a period of 15 to 30 years of history, and there's 382 of them. They come all the way from Levant and Mesopotamia. They're dealing with matters of state, requests for money and funding. But here's where it gets interesting. A number of these letters are from the Levant, Canaan, and they are complaints. And they are talking to Pharaoh about a group of people who are attacking and conquering cities throughout the land. Can we maybe correlate that with anything at this time? Okay. So I think it correlates directly to the account of the conquest after the Exodus. And many of these letters beg the Pharaoh for help, and the defending against foreign people called the Habaru. All right. Now, scholars like to argue what Habaru means. And what we would suggest to you is Hebrews are Habaru. Not all Habaru are Hebrews. Okay? But Hebrews are Habaru. Okay? And so, if the Exodus did occur when we suggested the 15th century, then these events described in these letters fall in the early Judges period. All right? And so let's look at a couple of these letters written to Pharaoh. Tablet 286 is a plea from Abdi-Hebda, the mayor of Jerusalem. What does he say to Pharaoh? Message of Abdi-Hebda, your servant. May the king, again Egypt's Pharaoh, provide for his land. All the lands of the king, my lord, have deserted. Lost are all the mayors, or as I told you a minute ago, the kings. There is not one mayor or king remaining to the king, the Pharaoh, my lord. The king has no lands. See, one of the things we know from history, this region is a subject vassal state to Egypt. And when we understand that, so the conquest of the Israelites, these are vassals to Egypt. The Habaru has plundered all the lands of the king. If there are any archers this year, the lands of the king, my lord, will remain. In another, I don't know if it's the translation of this or another one, I'm familiar with the text where it says, basically I'm going to say it my way. If you don't send archers, we ain't going to make it. All right? You have to send archers. 299 was written by the ruler of Gezer. To the king, my lord, since the Habaru are stronger than we, may the king, my lord, give me his help. And may the king, my lord, get me away from the Habaru, lest the Habaru destroy us. 288. Jerusalem's mayor's writing another letter. The other one wasn't apparently enough. All right? Note the description of the far-reaching extent of the Habaru conquest. May the king give thought to his land. The land of the king is lost. All of it has attacked me. I am situated like a ship in the midst of the sea. Now the Habaru have taken the very cities of the king. Not a single mayor or king remains to the king, my lord. All are lost. Now, doesn't that match incredibly well? All right, here are a list of the cities that are mentioned in both the conquest narratives of Joshua and the Amarna tablets. Okay? And so, very interesting. All right, now, before I go on, I had a thought I wanted to share on those. Getting too old. It's gone. It's gone. I'll remember it when this is over. I'll try to get my question up. All right. So we're going to move on, and that'll come back to me, I hope. All right. So I want to talk about something called the Berlin pedestal. This was housed. Sometimes some of the greatest discoveries in archaeology are things that archaeologists and scholars have collected, done nothing with, and stored in dusty old boxes in the bottom of museums and universities. And somebody, many years later, gets around to opening the box and taking a closer look. This is an example of one of those. This is a portion of an Egyptian inscription, and it's housed in the Egyptian Museum in Berlin. It has 3 name rings on it. Remember the name rings and then the prisoners that are bound? The first 2 name rings clearly read Ashkelon and Canaan. So this is putting us in a geographical area, okay? In the area of Canaan and Ashkelon, a city there in the region of Canaan. The 3rd name ring is damaged, but enough of it exists so we can reconstruct it. But I'll get to that in a minute, okay? In a recent re-examination of the inscription, scholars noted the names Ashkelon and Canaan largely were written consonantally and reflect writing examples from the reigns of Tutmosis III and Amenhotep II. Interesting names, right? And they reflect that and not later periods in time. Now, let's read the 3rd name ring, okay? On the left, we see the black, what is preserved. On the red, we can see what we have to fill in. The inscription, because there's enough of it, as you can see from the letters, enough of each letter exists that we know what the letter is. What does it read? Israel. Now, it doesn't say Israel, it says Israel, okay? Here's the thing. There is no other place. This is very early. There is no other name of a location anywhere in that region called Israel, okay? So it clearly seems to be, the interpretation is this is an early spelling of the name Israel. What does it indicate from the time frame it is from? It shows us the Israelites have migrated to Canaan sometime in the middle of the 2nd century, 2nd millennium BC, at the time the Bible gives us. All right? Now, I want to finish with one final very famous artifact that deals with this. It's called the Merneptah stele, okay? This dates a little later. This is to the 13th century BC, and it describes Pharaoh Merneptah's military victories. This is the first unattested or unchallenged mention of the name of Israel as a nation. The word for Israel used, it mentions Israel in this stele. The word used indicates they were a people group with no fixed boundaries. This is keeping with the biblical description of Israel in the Judges period. If you read carefully, it is clear in Joshua and Judges, they tend to maintain, maybe down to the time of David, their nomadic type living in tents. We automatically want to assume they're just moving in houses and stuff, but that doesn't seem to be, and there are references to Israel returning to your tents, things of that nature is how we know that. So this description in this shows a loose confederation of people. So how does the inscription read? Canaan is captive with all woe. Ashkelon is conquered. Gezer seized. Yenoam made non-existent. Israel is laid waste, bare of seed. Of course, Merneptah destroyed them all, right? That's what he claims. Well, obviously not, but it's a clear reference to them as a people group established in the land. All right? So here's where we're at as we finish up. We've had a very brief introduction to the subject of the Exodus and how archaeology relates. I propose that once we study the basic surface evidence, is what you've seen today, that statements that we often see in the secular media that there is no evidence for the Exodus, that just doesn't hold water. It has no merit, and it's a foolish statement, okay? All right? What evidence that is available, confessing that the evidence can and should be, based on what would have existed in Goshen, is limited, but the evidence we do have supports the descriptions in the biblical text well. All right? So I forget when I'm supposed to stop. I thought I had more time, so we're going to take it now for questions and answers, and I hope you enjoyed my first presentation on the Exodus. Thank you for being a good group and listening and smiling and being good. All right?
You got a question over there?
Yes.
All right.
All right.
Before we do questions, I know this guy. What we're going to do is Henry's also going to be available. This is the final public Q&A, so maybe 10 minutes or so of questions for either of you guys on any presentations. And then when we conclude after that, all these things will be available. These guys will be available to talk. So
as we get that question, remember the rule. This is my 5th presentation in 2 days. My brain is smoking. Henry gets the hard questions, right? Yes, sir.
Yeah, the Exodus story obviously has a lot to say about how the plagues are against individual Egyptian gods.
Yes.
And it's told in such a way to reflect on worship, because Moses first asked, "Let my people go to worship." So it's obviously told with that agenda. Evangelicals and minimalists agree on that. I'm just wondering if you could square history versus the fact that the story has a very specific agenda for those things like worship.
Okay.
Does my question make sense?
I think so, but I want to handle it from the perspective of you're asking what I'm hearing, and what I kind of want to talk about is that the accusation that the story is told in a way that it is an attack on Egyptians' gods, on Egypt's gods, among other things. And so what we have to remember is, how long are Israelites in Egypt? Okay? Whether you're a long sojourn or short sojourn person, these people have been there a long time. They are Egyptianized. All right? This is the way of life they know. You notice Moses says, when I go, who am I going to say sin sent me? Why? Because they live in a world where there's a God for everything and for everywhere. Okay? And so that is the culture their great-grandfathers lived in. At this point, they have no memory. They have the family stories, but they have no real cognitive personal memory of living elsewhere. This is the world they know. And so when we see the plagues, clearly God is saying, he's taking down all these Egyptian gods. And he's saying, I am God. Let me show you who's not, is the way I'd say it. And I don't know if that's answering your question. I think it was more specific to worship. But that's kind of the point I think is important to recognize. That is correct. I think we see that there. So am I on what you want to talk about, or a little?
Yeah, just because critics will just say, well, this was written with an agenda.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, I believe God had an agenda. And the agenda is to say, I'm God and these false gods are not. And so I think the problem is one of those false things to say that there is an agenda there, separates it from history. That doesn't make sense to me. I think it's very clear. I think the easy answer is there is an agenda. The agenda is God showing I am the one and only truly God, and I'm proving that these other gods that you are indoctrinated with have no power. So, Henry, do you have any thought on that? A little deeper thought?
I think it's a really good question.
Yeah.
The accusation that there's an agenda, I think Tom is right.
Mic on?
Yeah, maybe I should.
Is your mic on? You took your mic off?
No, I took it off. I wasn't supposed to do that. But so the question of the agenda is not a question of whether there's an agenda. It's whose agenda is it?
Yeah.
And so I think that's part of the way we ought to think, at least Christianly, about it, and then to deal with all writings from the ancient world or any time are always going to be selective. You can't be exhaustive, otherwise the Bible would be a mile thick. So that's something else to think about. There's certain events that are recorded and others that are not. I don't know, maybe that's helpful. There's a lot of paradigms built into that argument about agendas, like how does a modern scholar know what the author's agenda was, except for what comes from the text? So there's a lot there.
Yeah, you were presenting about the palace that was close to Goshen. Mm-hmm. What is the objective? You mentioned the tombs and how they were wealthy comparison. How does the archaeological evidence for, let's say, that the plagues did not touch Goshen versus the proximity of that palace may have given evidence of, hey, they abandoned it because of a plague or something. But it seems to me there would be evidence there of untouched land versus another area.
Well, the evidence about the abandonment seems to show the site is abandoned. Okay, and like I said, the one scholar says they packed up and moved off overnight. As far as archaeological evidence for the plagues, I don't know. You're not going to find archaeological evidence of those events. Now, there is a document that scholars dispute over called the Ipuwer. Am I saying it right, Henry? Papyrus?
You say Ipuwer, I say Ipuwer.
I think you're right.
Potato.
And you know, and to be fair, it's something that they argue because the copies we have are later, but it's clear it's written from an earlier time. And that document is very intriguing, as it seems to describe what may well be the plague events from an Egyptian perspective. But you notice I want to be cautious because we don't have enough evidence to absolutely tie it, in my opinion, that we know that's what that is. But I think it's something interesting to study because it may well date from that period and relate those memories, Egyptian memory of those events. But I don't want to go so far and say this is absolutely what it is, because it's really hard to absolutely prove that from the evidence, but it's intriguing. Question in the back?
Yeah, you had showed some inscriptions, and they had the name rings and the prisoner, and you said it clearly depicted a Semite or Semites. I was just wondering if you could explain how you come to the conclusion of what characteristics or traits demonstrate that.
So I'm not making that conclusion, as I'm not an expert on what a Semite looks like in the 14th century BC. But scholars, that is the fairest way to answer that in my understanding is that is something that scholars agree on. This is not a area of argument. It has to do with hairstyle, clothing, attire. But for me to tell you what a Semite's hairstyle is, I've read material on that. I don't remember. But it's those things. For example, the one before you saw an African prisoner, and you could see the different hairstyles and different attire. So that's how you do it.
Semites often had the beard.
Yeah, they had the yep.
In the Egyptian depictions.
Yep.
And then if you have colored like paint, like from tombs, Nubians, darker skin typically. So yeah, they've been able to work out those differences, and they're pretty well agreed upon, I think, right?
Yep.
It's not really disputed.
Yep, that's my understanding.
Yeah,
it is what it is.
Yep.
Others?
I was just wondering, when you were talking about the earlier Exodus date of, I think it was 1200 BC, and that was kind of accepted based on work in the 50s and 60s. What was the evidence that made people think that earlier date was correct?
That's a big question. And what it had to do with was they thought they weren't finding evidence of the Exodus when it should have been at that point. So it became more of a, and Henry can add to this, but it became more of a, before that date, nobody really argued when it was, because here's what the text says, it gives you a time frame. It's after that date we started getting into these different things. And so they look at the numbers and they make arguments, and I want to be fair, there are good Christian scholars who will follow that later date. Absolutely disagree with their opinion, doesn't mean they're not a good Christian, and they have some good reason for that. But they do things like the 480 years in the verse, whether you get the 480 or the 440 from the Septuagint, whatever, they take those years and they say they're honorific. In other words, it doesn't really mean what it says. And it means so many generations. And so they put it down, and they also want to, they really hang on the verse which says they built the store cities of Ramses and help me, Henry, I'm tired. The other city. Doesn't matter. Ramses is the important one.
Yeah, Ramses.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And so.
I'm blanking out there, Tommy. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And so
Sukkot and Ramses.
Something like that. But they really put a lot of weight on that. And the problem is you have to really change those numbers. And what they thought was there was no evidence of the Exodus and conquest at the time it should have been. They thought there was evidence later. We have a lot more information now. And for example, the site I talked about, el-Daba, that's been excavated in the last 20, 30 years. I think our evidence now. So I like how one Christian scholar put it. They gave the archaeology a little more weight than the text, and we have to be very cautious about that. We want to be good with the text and and not dogmatic that things are. It has to be the way I've always seen it. It's what does the text say, and so that's part of it. And I just think it's, in my opinion, it's really hard. I think now we even have more evidence that time frame just doesn't work, and that the time the Bible gives us, really we have good reasons to look at it as the proper time. So
I could
Henry?
piggyback that just slightly. I'll make it real quick. So 1 Kings 6:1 is the key text, the 480 years. But actually in the Hebrew, it's an ordinal number. So it's in the 80th year and the 400th year is actually how it appears in the Hebrew. That is a literal number. It's actually 479 years because it's an inclusive number, which is not symbolic. Nowhere in the Hebrew Bible are ordinal numbers used symbolically. So the text is very specific. It's always been interpreted that way until German scholarship of the 19th century started. I found a source in the mid-1850s that started doing that, a German scholar, and that kind of found its way into sort of evangelicalism. So there's a history there. The text is really specific, and it puts it in a month and a year of Solomon's reign. So the context of that number is clearly specific. It's not a symbolic interpretation. So I think the evidence is strong just from the text itself that you can't symbolize 1 Kings 6:1.
Mm-hmm.
So does it go back to that once they have scientists, archaeologists, whatever, that whole paradigm that needs to be shifted? Wouldn't it go back to that they stuck on that, and that's where they stand until their paradigm shifts to what the truth actually is?
So I'm going to let Henry answer that since it's a paradigm question. He talked about that today. We'll throw that at him.
It's such a favorite subject of mine. Yes, the paradigm is the issue, and in the background of this is theories about the origin of the biblical text itself. So I'll use Joshua for an example because this is an easier example. The consensus is that the book of Joshua was written like at the time of Josiah, which would be like 700 BC, something like that. That's about 700 years after the time of actually Joshua. So the thinking there is, you crazy evangelicals, you're trying to find archaeological evidence from a story that originated 700 years later. So for them, it's a false starting point. The paradigm says Joshua originated at the time of Josiah. So it's a non-starter to even talk about archaeology from that period because we know that Joshua's text comes from this later period of time. So your attempt to correlate it with stuff we find in the ground, we're not even going to entertain that discussion. That's kind of the way it works. Now, they wouldn't say it that way, but that's fundamentally how the paradigm controls the way that this is thought about. Now, you come at it from our perspective, Joshua is probably the one who wrote Joshua. It seems probably logical from the text. It doesn't say it explicitly, right? He seems to be an eyewitness. It seems very clear, right? The Jericho material that Tommy went over today. No one could have known these details about the text up into the city and so on. So when we take the archaeology, we say, which paradigm fits the archaeology better? Our paradigm or their paradigm? And then you try to persuade someone, come over to this paradigm and see how the evidence fits better, and maybe they'll consider it. So that's part of what the clash is. There's this underlying set of assumptions that really control the way people think about it. So I hope that's helpful.
And just a plug for their YouTube channel. Associates of Biblical Research has a YouTube page. Henry does the Digging for Truth show. And what his answer was there about paradigms, that's a regular discussion. He'll bring in an expert, and they won't be dogmatic, but they'll say, what does the evidence really lead us to believe? We have scripture, we have archaeology. What's the best making sense of this data set? And then we're grateful for it. So I just really want to encourage you all, the Digging for Truth YouTube channel through the Associates for Biblical Research YouTube channel. It's a great recommendation, hundreds of videos so far. Probably time for two more public questions, and then we'll be done. And then you can do your Christmas shopping.
I commend that commercial, by the way, Pastor Dave. That was very good.
I was not paid on behalf of AP. I'm just a customer.
Piggybacking on your mentioning of the 1850 scholars, at that time they had also said Troy did not exist. It was the classical scholars who thought it still did. And I was thinking, would also they be debating the numbers? Like, how can there be this many Israelis at that time? And there was also this thought that city population was also only limited to city borders and not to the edge of their city-state. So I'm curious how that might have affected one of the reasons they're rejecting numbers.
Mm-hmm. When you're talking about numbers, are you talking about the population of the Israelites coming out of Egypt specifically? Yeah. Yeah, the number of soldiers or troops. It's hard to answer that question because of some of the Hebrew text. There's disputes about the interpretation of it. Even some evangelicals debate the meaning. The word Eleph is used, and it's often translated as thousand, but it also can mean units. It can mean, it depends on if it's a military campaign. So I don't mean to be wishy-washy on the answer. The question of the population numbers is a little different than what I described before as far as like chronological figures, which are clearly intended to be historical. I'm not suggesting there weren't millions of people coming out of Egypt. I just haven't looked at it closely enough where I'm certain that Eleph always means thousand. So for myself personally, here's a lesson in maybe humility. When you start studying the Bible more and more in one area and you learn a lot, you discover you don't know as much about a lot of other areas. So I don't like to give wishy-washy answers when I'm out in public, but on that one, the jury's out for me personally to sort that out. So it's probably not helpful, but it's truthful.
I think it was more just to indicate that if someone thought that was wrong, they just passed on the other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of has a snowball effect.
They didn't look on what you've looked on the other side, saying these numbers are always used this way.
Yeah.
With the other ones.
Thank you,
That's what I
sir.
was trying to-
Looks like Michael's got the last public question.
Is there any archaeological evidence as to where the sea parted?
Where the Exodus Sea parted.
Ooh, that's a big one. Oh, gosh. What do you think, Henry?
Yeah, so the Red Sea crossing, right? There's dispute about that, partly because there's so many places in the Exodus itinerary where we just simply don't know where a lot of the places were in the Sinai because they were nomadic. The Israelites were nomads, and they had no cities and all that other kind of thing. There's a couple of general theories. There's one that it's close to the land of Goshen, the Egyptian delta. There was a series of lakes that ran through there in antiquity. They would have been formidable. The Israelites would not have been able to get through them. Look, I would like to imagine that it was as giant as Charlton Heston's classic parting of the Red Sea. I'm not denying it was a miracle, but the extent that it was a miracle based on the size of the body of water. So you have that. You have another view that it was all the way down towards Saudi Arabia, and there's a couple of other theories. As far as archaeology goes, I mean, some of the descriptions, there's Baal Zephon and Pi-hahiroth are two towns that seem to be nearby. Those seem to be closer to the delta, so in my view, it points in that direction. But this is a highly disputed question in conservative scholarship. I think the jury's still out. I lean personally towards the closer to the delta view, but I'm willing to change my mind if somebody presents a better evidence. So another wishy-washy answer from me. But when you don't know, you're not 100% sure. It was a miracle. The Israelites were delivered for certain. What we read in the text happened. Where it happened exactly is not sure.
Right.